I'm so excited about the two new MacBook Pro models. I've already pre-ordered both sizes and I can't wait to tell you all about them. I was kind of waiting for this announcement. I wasn't sure what we were going to get, and I can definitely say that Apple exceeded my expectations. Now we can finally forget about all the speculations and the leaks and take a look at what's coming with the new MacBooks. So practically speaking, the MacBook Pro is designed to target a more demanding user. And that was one of my issues with the M1 model because I didn't feel like there was enough separation between the Air and the Pro. Well, that is no longer the case. Apple unveiled two new models, a 14-inch and a 16-inch. Both have been completely redesigned. They got new chips, more memory, a new display, more ports, and they took care of a lot of the opportunities for improvements that I mentioned in my 13-inch M1 MacBook videos. Starting off, Apple announced two new chips which expand the M1 SoC or System on Chip family. So now we have a more powerful M1 Pro and then like an absurdly more powerful M1 Max. I'll give you a brief highlight of both chips in this video, but I'll have a more detailed video in just a bit if you're interested in learning more. Just like with the older one, these two new chips focus on providing performance and efficiency. So let's quickly take a look at the specs and then talk about how they will impact performance. The new M1 Pro offers up to a 10-core CPU with 8 high performance cores and 2 high efficiency cores. It also offers a GPU with up to 16 cores and then up to 32 gigabytes of unified memory or RAM. Now this setup would deliver 70% faster CPU performance than the M1 chip, 200 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, which is nearly 3 times that of the M1, and then of course 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is twice the maximum that's available on the M1. We're also getting a ProRes accelerator in the media engine and a few other things that I'll discuss in my dedicated video. Now moving on to the M1 Max, Apple calls it the most powerful chip for a Pro notebook. It takes things to the next level. Now, this is true even though it uses the same 10-core CPU as the M1 Pro, but then it doubles the GPU with up to 32 cores, and that will result in up to 2 times faster GPU performance than the M1 Pro and 4 times faster than the M1. It also has up to 400 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, which is 2 times that of the M1 Pro and almost 6 times that of the M1. Now finally, you can upgrade the M1 Max with up to 64 gigabytes of unified memory, which is insane because it's available to both the CPU and the GPU. So I just can't wait to see what that can do. I know my musician friends who use Logic Pro are gonna love this. If you're a 3D artist or if you do more intensive video editing, these new chips are gonna absolutely crush it. This is ridiculous. The M1 Max can edit up to 30 streams of 4K ProRes video, or up to 7 streams of 8K ProRes in Final Cut Pro. I mean, if you ever see me with 30 streams of 4K, please stop me and then call for help, but I'm super glad that these new machines can handle that. Now, like I said before, I'll get into more detail in my dedicated M1 Pro and M1 X preview video, but let me just say that for the users who actually need this, having this much power in a laptop, and then more important, having this much power when using battery power is absolutely incredible. Now, I can't wait to test the render speeds for Final Cut Pro and then also see how it impacts Premiere Pro. And I'm also curious to see if I can notice a difference in Lightroom and in Photoshop. Now, when you compare the new 14-inch MacBook Pro to the 13-inch MacBook Pro, whether you're using the M1 Pro or the M1 Max, you're getting significantly better performance. And even though I still think the M1 MacBook Air is an amazing option for the majority of users, we're finally seeing that gap in performance that I expect when I compare a MacBook Air and a MacBook Pro. Now you're gonna see a similar gap if you compare the 16-inch MacBook Pro to the previous model, and this is only the beginning. So both the 14 and the 16-inch models also got a new design. And again, the focus was on optimizing the space inside of the new aluminum enclosure for improved air movement. Now the new dual fan system can move 50% more air than the previous generation and can deliver outstanding sustained performance while staying cool and quiet. And if you remember my M1 MacBook Pro videos, I showed you that the fan almost never went on, and even when it did, you could only hear it once it got to about 25 to 2700 RPM. So I expect similar performance from the two new models. Another major upgrade to the design is the screen, which has been upgraded to a liquid Retina XDR display. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it features the same mini LED technology that we got in the 12.9-inch M1 iPad Pro. This new display delivers up to 1000 nits of sustained full screen brightness. It then has the same 1600 nits of max brightness and 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio that we saw in the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. We're getting outstanding dynamic range for HDR content with more details in the shadows and deeper blacks. It's also a DCI-P3 display, which is a wider color gamut, so it offers more accurate color reproduction and smoother gradients. This isn't just great for photographers and videographers, it's actually going to be a better looking display when you're watching content. Now, as soon as they said liquid Retina XDR display, I said to myself, are they actually going to do this? And they did. These new MacBooks are now getting ProMotion, which is Apple's adaptive refresh rate. So this means that the MacBook Pro can automatically change the refresh rate of the display up to 120 Hz based on the type of content that's being displayed. So basically, if you're reading a web page, it can reduce the refresh rate to save on battery life. But if you're scrolling or gaming or interacting with the operating system, then it can bump the refresh rate up and give you a smoother and more responsive user experience. I literally cannot wait to see this display in real life, especially the 16-inch model. And just in case you're worried, if you're a video editor, you can lock the refresh rate at what's optimal for your footage. So then you don't have to worry about it changing. Now, overall, the display is also larger than the previous generation because of the smaller 3.5mm bezels. So these new bezels are 24% thinner on the left and the right, and then 60% thinner at the top, where we do have a camera notch, and don't worry, I'll get back to that in just a minute. Now, as far as the actual size, we're getting a 16.2-inch display with a resolution of 3456 by 2234 on the larger model, and then a 14.2-inch display with a resolution of 3024 by 1964. That means that the 14-inch model actually has more pixels than the previous generation 16-inch MacBook Pro, and that's kind of insane. Now let's get to the keyboard, and the changes this year are a little bittersweet to me. First, it looks awesome. The new Magic Keyboard is set in a double anodized black weld. It gives it a nice separation from the palm rest assembly. The biggest change is that Apple removed the touch bar and replaced it with a full height function row. And with this move, the masses rejoice. Personally, I really like the touch bar, but I read all of your comments and I know that a lot of you didn't. So Apple listened and it gave you what you wanted. Now you have that tactile feel of the function keys and you'll no longer need to look down to make sure that you're pressing the right button. We're also still getting my favorite trackpad on any laptop, so there are no changes there, but in my opinion, there were none needed. Now let's get back to the camera, and I'm curious to know what you think. Like, clearly, the notch is going to be a divisive element. Some users are going to appreciate the additional display real estate, and then others are going to complain about it interfering with the clean look of the display. Personally, I want to see it in real life and then make up my mind. Ultimately, it's going to have the menu behind it, and when I'm watching content in full screen, I'm assuming there will be a black bar behind it, but I want to see how it plays out in real life, and then I'll definitely include it in my detailed reviews. Now, the camera itself was upgraded to 1080p. Thank goodness. It was definitely time to get rid of the older 720p cameras. And on top of the resolution, I'm also excited that Apple reported a 2-time improvement on low light performance, because we can't all do our video calls in perfect lighting. The combination of the new camera and the computational video capabilities of these new powerful chips make this the best camera on any MacBook. And again, I'm excited to test the differences. I'm also super excited for the new audio system. The new microphone is going to be better with lower noise floor, and that's going to be great for video calls. But the new speaker system should be an even more drastic improvement. So I actually think that the 13-inch MacBook Pro sounds really good for a laptop. So I can't wait to hear this new 6-speaker sound system with force-canceling woofers and wide stereo sound. We're also getting support for spatial audio when playing music or video with Dolby Atmos, which is going to be really interesting to hear on a laptop. Now, the next major improvement is the ports. Now, I had some serious issues with the 13-inch MacBook Pro because, again, it's designed for a more demanding user, and 2 ports are just not enough, especially when you have to use one of them to charge. The new MacBook Pros have an HDMI port, a Thunderbolt 4 port, and an SD card slot on the right side, and then 2 more Thunderbolt 4 ports, a headphone jack, and a new MagSafe 3 port on the left. This means that A, you're not going to need to use an adapter or a hub for either HDMI or an SD card slot, so you're not wasting a port. And then B, if you're using MagSafe to charge your laptop, you still have 3 open Thunderbolt 4 ports. Now, of course, if you wanted to, you could still charge using the Thunderbolt ports, which means you can now charge the MacBook Pro from both sides. As far as connectivity and external displays, you can hook up to 2 Pro Display XDRs if you're using the M1 Pro, and if you're using the M1 Max, you can hook up to 3 Pro Display XDRs and a 4K TV. Now I want to talk about battery life, where one of my favorite things about the M1 MacBooks is the fantastic power efficiency. And they're good to the point where I'm surprised when I actually need to charge them. As a point of reference, the MacBook Air is rated for 18 hours and the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro is rated for 20 hours. Now looking at the 2 new models, the 14-inch MacBook Pro is rated at up to 17 hours, which is 7 hours more than the previous model. And the 16-inch is the highest rated MacBook Pro ever with 21 hours of battery life. That's gonna be absolutely insane. 21 hours, are you kidding me? That's 10 hours more than the previous model. 10 hours more. Like some of my laptops don't even last 10 hours, period. Now I want to talk about the configuration because there are a ton of different options here. So if we're looking at the 14-inch model, it starts out with the M1 Pro, an 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, 512 gigs of internal storage, and 16 gigs of unified memory for $1,999. You can double the unified memory to 32 gigs for $400. If you're looking for the M1 Max, then it starts out at $2,899 with a 10-core CPU, 24-core GPU, 512 gigabytes of internal storage, and 32 gigs of unified memory. You can double the unified memory to 64 gigs for an additional $400. Now, as far as storage options, we start out at 512 and we max out at an 8 terabyte SSD for an additional $2,400. Yeah, $2,400. If you opt for an 8-core CPU model, you're getting a 64-watt USB-C power adapter, and anything with a 10-core CPU gets a more powerful 96-watt adapter. With the 16-inch model, there is no 8-core model, so we're starting out with an M1 Pro 10-core CPU, 16-core GPU, 512 gigs of internal storage, and 16 gigabytes of unified memory for $2,499. The baseline M1X model, of course, again, comes with a 10-core CPU, a 24-core GPU, 512 gigs of internal storage, and 32 gigs of unified memory for $3,099. The nice thing here is that the decision comes down to the size of the device, since you can get the same amount of processing power and the same number of ports on the 14 and the 16-inch models. So make sure that you think about this choice carefully, because a larger display is always nice to have, but it also means you're carrying a much larger device with you. And even with how thin and sleek the new MacBook Pros are, 16 inches is still 16 inches. So make sure that you're comfortable carrying that with you. I pre-ordered both the 14 and the 16, so I'll be able to do comparisons for you, show them to you side by side, then help you choose the right model for you. I spent a ton of time reading your comments, and I know that so many of you are really excited about the 2 new MacBook Pro models, so let me know what you think in the comment section. If you want to learn more about the performance of these devices, watch this video right here about the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips. You know what I always say? Buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.